In homework 1.8, there are two main things you're working on. Well, obviously the product and the quotient rule, but additionally, different ways the questions can be asked. All of these show up on the AP exam pretty often, and you want to be familiar with all. This first question, it asks you to determine f prime of 1. Well, what you're going to do is you're going to find the derivative and plug in 1. This second one, it asks you to determine the slope of the line tangent to the curve at pi over 4. Well, the slope of the tangent line is the derivative. So you need to find the derivative and then plug in pi over 4. The third one says, this time it's a function of t, but I want you to find f prime of t. Works exactly the same way as if it were x's. You should end up with a formula for the slopes at different t values. And the fourth one asks you to determine dy dx. I'll do this one because I think it's the most complicated of the set. To find dy dx, we're doing the derivative. It's another way of asking you for f prime of x, or y prime. We have two different things separated by a plus, and our sum and difference rule says you can just do each one separately. So we're going to do the derivative of this first term, x squared sine of x first, and then we'll deal with this one. X squared sine of x is a product. We have x squared times sine of x. So the derivative of this product, we have to use the product rule. The product rule says if you have two functions, f and g, you do the derivative of the first one times the second, plus the derivative of the second one times the first. So the derivative of the first one is 2x, using the power rule. The derivative of the first one times the second, we don't do the derivative there, plus we leave the first one alone and do the derivative of the second. The derivative of sine of x is cosine of x. So you do need to know your product rule, that if you have f times g, the derivative of that is the derivative of the first times the second, plus leave the first one alone and do the derivative of the second. This is the product rule that we should know. Okay. This was just the derivative of this first part. Now we can deal with this second one. And this is also a product rule. In this case, f is 2x and g is cosine of x. So, plus the derivative of the first, the derivative of 2x is just 2. The derivative of cosine of x is negative sine of x. That's the product rule. The derivative of the first times the second, plus the derivative, we leave the first one alone, so it's going to be 2x times the, oh my goodness, I messed up the product rule. Ooh, I hope you were yelling at me on your computer a second ago. On this first one, when we did the product rule, it's supposed to be the derivative of the first times the second. I did the derivative of the first, I also did the derivative of the second. That's very, very bad. It should be just 2 times cosine of x. You don't do the derivative of the second one. You do the derivative of the first times the second. Now, for the second part of the product rule, we leave the first one alone and do the derivative of the second one. Now we're going to get the negative sine of x. That's actually a pretty frequent mistake, and I'm not going to redo this video because I hope you caught that mistake as I was doing it. We need to simplify this negative. It's going to be 2x times negative sine of x. That's minus 2x sine of x. And we're going to look for any common factors we can deal with. And you'll notice we have 2x sine of x minus 2x sine of x. That will cancel out. And so all we're left with is dy dx equals x squared cosine of x plus 2 cosine of x. If you wanted to, you could factor out the cosine of x, but there's no reason to. What that would look like if you factored out cosine of x is cosine of x times x squared plus 2. And a multiple choice question might have this as the answer, and you'd need to know how to factor out the cosine of x to get there. All right, this next section. The AP exam loves questions like this. I'm going to do f. It says find f prime of 2. That means we're going to take the derivative of f and plug in 2 for x. Given that g of 2 is 3, g prime of 2 is negative 2, h of 2 is negative 1, and h prime of 2 is 4. We're not actually going to use any of this at first, because you can't plug in at the beginning. You need to wait till after you've done the derivative to plug it in. The first thing we're always going to do is just find the derivative using our rules, and then plug in when we can. So, let's look at f. I'll do this one because I think it's the one most likely to give you trouble. To find f prime of x, well, we have a quotient. It's 2x being divided by h of x. And let's recall our quotient rule. The quotient rule says if we have f of x equals g of x over h of x, or maybe we could say h of x equals f of x over g of x. It doesn't really matter. The derivative, I'm just using f and g here because they used f and g. The derivative is similar to the product rule. You do the derivative of the top times the bottom minus the derivative of the bottom times the top. So h prime, I'm just going to put, without the f of x here because I ran out of room, h prime times g divided by the bottom squared. This should remind you of the product rule, because the product rule is you do the derivative of the first times the second plus the derivative of the second times the first. It's also fine to do g times h prime of x. It doesn't matter which way you do it in. The multiplication doesn't matter. So let's see. F prime of x is going to be the derivative of the top one, which is 2, times the bottom without doing the derivative, minus, leave the top one alone, and do the derivative of the bottom. Doing the derivative of the bottom, we just put h prime of x for now. All divided by the bottom squared. The last thing we need to do is we're doing f prime of 2. So it's going to be 2 times h of 2. Now we have to go back to the top and look at h of 2. h of 2 is negative 1. So 2 times negative 1 minus, all right, 2x is going to be 2. Our x that we're plugging in here is 2 times h prime of 2, which is 4. All divided by h of x. H of 2 is negative 1 squared. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2 minus 2 times 2 is 4 times 4 is 16. So we get negative 2 minus 16 is negative 18 divided by negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. So our answer is f prime of 2 equals negative 18. Oh man, this threw off kids last year on the free response section. There was one almost exactly like this. I was very disappointed with how they did. I felt like it was a pretty easy question, and they did not do a good job with it. Here, it says u of x equals f of x g of x. Find u prime of 1. Well, alright, just use the product rule. The derivative of u of x is u prime of x. And the way we do that is we have a product. So we're going to do the derivative of the first one times the second, plus, leave the first one alone, times the derivative of the second. And since we're doing u prime of 1, we're just going to plug in 1 to all of these. We need to do f prime of 1, g of 1, plus f of 1, g prime of 1. Alright, well, how the hell do we do this? Well, we've got this graph here. F prime of 1, what does this mean? It means the slope of the tangent line at x equals 1. So we go to x equals 1, this is a linear function. The slope of the tangent line is just the slope of this linear function. And so we just are looking for what is the slope of this linear line. This linear function has a slope of, it goes up by 2 and over by 1. And so the slope at 1 for f of x is 2. The slope of this section is 2. G of 1 means what is the value of g of x when x is 1. G of 1 is the y value at x equals 1 on g of x. So that is 1, so 2 times 1, plus f of 1, we're no longer doing the slope, this is asking us for the y value at x equals 1. So on f of x, the y value is 2. The y value is 2, times g prime of 1. Well, g prime of 1 is now asking us the slope of the tangent line of g at x equals 1, and the slope of g is negative 1. It's going down by 1 and over by 1. So we get 2 minus 2, which is 0. This last one, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but I will tell you what kids will lose points for on their homework they do every year. They try to just make up a rule, and oftentimes they make up a rule using the answer key, and their whole homework gets counted as a 0. We know about this product rule. We want to come up with a product rule for a triple product. What you can't do is just guess rules and make up your own rules. What you can do is apply the product rule in a smart way here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to split this up. I'm going to split this up into f times gh prime. And so what's going on here is I've got the product of just two things. I've got f and GH. This would be like, if I were relabeling it, this would be my F and my G, right? These are my two things multiplying, and so now I can just use the product rule on this. The derivative of the first is F prime. We leave the second alone. Plus, we leave the first alone and do the derivative of GH. Well, to do the derivative of the second part, we have to use the product rule. The product rule is the derivative of the first times the second plus leave the first alone and do the derivative of the second. And I've made a mistake here on purpose that I hope you caught, which is that when I did the derivative of this, I ended up with a sum. But this sum is all being multiplied by f. So this really needed to go in parentheses so that the f multiplies by the entire derivative of GH, not just times the first part. We can simplify this and get f prime GH, that's from this first part, plus f g prime h plus f g h prime. That is our product rule when you have three things multiplying. We're not going to use this all as often. I would just split it up into a product of a product when you need to. That's all I'm going to work with you on this homework. For the tangent one, the challenge, I'm going to give you a hint. Rewrite f of x as two functions you do know the derivative of. You should know that tangent is sine of x over cosine of x. Those are two functions we know the derivative of, and this is now a quotient. So I'll leave you with that. I'll also give you a hint on number 10. My hint for you is going to be that you're going to need to find both a and b. Think to yourself, well, what does the tangent line tell you? How is the tangent line related to the original one? The tangent line has the slope that's the derivative of the original function. So start by finding the original derivative, plug in x equals 2, and that's got to equal the slope of the tangent line. So I'll leave you with that. Hopefully that helps.